Good morning, everyone, and welcome today to our biweekly forum. We're excited to host this important conversation today on immigration, and we're happy that you've taken time out of your day to join us. We meet here every other Thursday from 11 a.m. to 12:15 p.m., although some of our speakers stay afterwards if they can. Out of caution during the pandemic, we've moved our forum to this online webinar format in order to promote public safety and make our forums more accessible. Just a few notes about this new format that we feel that you should be aware of. Everyone except the forum presenters and Kirwan staff are muted in terms of audio video, so don't worry about having to mute yourself or deal with any video settings. No one can hear or see anyone except our speakers. Also, the chat feature is disabled for this webinar, but we encourage anyone to make use of the Q&A button to ask questions or raise concerns about the webinar. During the webinar, somebody from Kirwan will be monitoring the Q&A and will help you with any problems with the webinar, and we'll collect questions to ask the presenters when it comes time for Q&A. Finally, this webinar is being recorded so that we can make that available through our social media afterwards. No one except the presenters will be recorded, but we wanted to make everybody aware of that ahead of time, just for the sake of transparency. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Professor César García Hernández. Dr. Garcia Hernandez is a law professor and a Gregory Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at The Ohio State University, where he studies the intersection of criminal and immigration law. In December 2019, he published Migrating to Prison, America's Obsession with Locking Up Immigrants, about the United States' reliance on prisons to enforce immigration law. In 2015, he published his first book, Criminalization Law, an academic text that was released in a second edition in 2021. My apologies for butchering that for a moment. César's essays have appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Time Magazine, The Guardian, Newsweek, Salon, and elsewhere. He's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, National Public Radio, NBC News, Public Radio International, BBC, The Nation, Univision, Telemundo, and numerous other publications in the United States and around the world. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Garcia Hernandez.
Thank you so much for that wonderfully gracious introduction, Kip. It's quite a pleasure to join the Kirwan Institute and so many of its friends. I'm new to Ohio State, but I've long been familiar with the Kirwan Institute, and of course its rich tradition of interdisciplinary study of race and of ethnicity, and is one of the great attractions, or was one of the great attractions for me when contemplating joining the faculty at Ohio State. So I have the great privilege of serving in the role of the Gregory Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, as Kip mentioned. This is a position held by two faculty members before me, and both of them were deeply involved with the Kirwan Institute. So I am especially pleased to receive such a warm welcome early on in my first semester at Ohio State. And I hope that today marks only the first of many such occasions when I get to engage with the Kirwan Institute and its broad community. So as you heard, I study immigration law and immigration policy. And in the last few weeks, the politics and the possibilities for immigration law and policy have been on display subtly and not so subtly in major news stories. As the United States, for example, as the United States hurriedly withdrew from Afghanistan, immigration law affects who gets to come to the United States and under what conditions they get to stay. Meanwhile, President Trump's decision in the early days of the pandemic to tap a public health law to expel migrants arriving at the nation's southern border has been ricocheting through the courts, with the most recent decision coming out just last week. And for a few hours a week ago today, last Thursday, the politics of immigration threatened a legal and a law enforcement catastrophe when the governor of Texas announced that he would use state police and National Guard to shut down international ports of entry under the jurisdiction of the federal government and staffed by federal law enforcement officers. Before the governor backed off, I was envisioning armed state police blockading armed federal agents, and I did not like what I saw. Well, those are three news stories that have developed in more or less a period of 1 month. And those three news stories individually and collectively illustrate the perils of immigration politics. They illustrate the complexity of immigration policy, and they also illustrate the lasting hopefulness of migrants trying to tap one particular feature of immigration law in the United States, asylum. So over the next few minutes, let me reflect on the law of asylum's origins. Let me reflect on its limits and also on some options available to breathe more life into its saving grace. Today, we think of asylum as a legal obligation that in the United States derives from the federal law that governs immigration, which is called the Immigration and Nationality Act. And to an extent, that is correct. Thanks to a law that was enacted by Congress in 1980, the Refugee Act of 1980, the Immigration and Nationality Act offers the possibility of safe harbor to anyone who, in the words of the Immigration and Nationality Act, to anyone who is physically present in the United States, irrespective of such alien status. It's alien status, alien being the word that immigration law formally uses to describe anyone who is not a US citizen. So it does not matter, in the words of this federal law, it does not matter who you are. It does not matter how you got here. If you are in the United States and you are afraid for your life, federal law makes clear that you can request asylum. You can request it, but of course, you might not get it. In 2019, the last year for which the Department of Homeland Security has released data, 307,704 people applied for asylum, but only 46,508 received it. Well, to officials in the Trump administration, that was evidence of fraud, of conniving lawyers paired with unscrupulous migrants trying to subvert our democracy through frivolous legal filings. Well, another way to think about it is in light of what asylum law claims to do and what it does not claim to do. Asylum law does not promise to protect everyone from death. It does not promise to help all survivors of rape or everyone who's fleeing from violent gangs. Instead, asylum law claims only to protect people who can convince a representative of the United States government that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, a well-founded fear of persecution by the government or by people who the government cannot stop. And that the persecution would come because of one of 5 specific reasons: their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion, or their membership in a particular social group. So persecution by government officials, and because of one of 5 specific reasons. The law of asylum is indeed narrow. In Del Rio, Texas, last week, more than 10,000 people were held under a bridge along the river. Many fled Haiti at some point in recent years. Fear of death due to an earthquake's destruction is not persecution. During the Trump era, violent gangs and abusive spouses were not the perpetrators of violence or death that the law of asylum had eyes for. Asylum law revolves around the Immigration and Nationality Act, that federal law that governs immigration. But asylum law does not begin there, nor does it end there. given its limits, as we think about the possibilities for asylum law, we have to imagine the politics of migration. And for that, it's worthwhile to consider whether this last-ditch legal grasp to life, where it comes from. Well, to find its origins, we have to go back much further in time than 1980. We must travel at least to ancient antiquity, when Heracles found refuge in Athens. We must consider the Apostle Paul, who walked freely despite having been party to the murder of Stephen, a role that he admits to in the Christian Bible's book of Acts, saying, "When the blood of the martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him." Heracles, who the myths tell us was a hero and a philanderer. Paul, the saint who was also an accessory to murder, welcomed despite their transgressions, celebrated despite their flaws. Now, we do not find our laws in ancient fables, but we do find our traditions in these stories and in so many others like them. We find the possibility of redemption in these stories and so many like them. We find violent actors who are reimagined as heroes and as saints. We find the possibility of rehabilitation, because redemption and rehabilitation are no strangers to the law, but the law can create strangers for whom redemption and rehabilitation are beyond reach. It's 1937. Europe was convulsing from the weight of Nazi expansion. The Berlin Olympics had concluded. German forces had entered the Rhineland. The Nuremberg laws had redefined German citizenship to exclude Jews from the citizenry. Kristallnacht was on the horizon, and from there, the horror of horrors that followed. In that year, a man known simply by one name, Seidel, found himself in the French port of Marseille, witnessing an exodus as Europe's refugees tried, often in vain, to leave the continent. As Seidel described the scene, Marseille was full of mothers who had lost their children, children who had lost their mothers, human hordes who had been chased from all the countries of the earth, forever running from one death toward another. Seidel, it should be said, was not a real person. He was the narrator. He is the narrator in Transits, a novel by Anna Sagers, in which she focuses on the ordinariness of that most extraordinary situation. The long lines, the tired feet, the uncontrolled outburst of a young child, and the complicated romance of two young adults find themselves in this situation. But this was no ordinary novel, and this was no ordinary novelist. Sagers had herself transited across the Atlantic. As a Jewish communist intellectual, she had first fled Germany. Later, she fled Europe entirely, finding safety in Mexico City, turning to Latin America for refuge, as many Jews, as many leftists, as many intellectuals did in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Having survived, Sagers wrote about the ordinariness of all those who did not. Having obtained the necessary documents to breathe to live, to think, to dream, to write. Sagers reflected on those who did not, writing, what harm could it do to a giant nation if a few of these saved souls, worthy, half worthy, or unworthy, were to join them in their country? How could it possibly harm such a big country? Sagers, through the narrator, Seidel, asks. Well, this is the cultural and the legal tradition from which the modern law of asylum rises, tucked firmly into the Immigration and Nationality Act. Asylum law in the United States, it's itself largely a codification for domestic actors of the obligations that the United States agreed to when it joined the protocol relating to the status of refugees, International Convention. In turn, the Refugee Protocol, created in 1967, and the earlier Refugee Convention, which goes back to 1951, reflects the international legal principle of non-refoulement, a French term that bars states from returning a person to a location where she will be persecuted. This entitlement, in turn, stems from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which provides in Article 14, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. It is plain and it is simple to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Yet it is also plain from this simple recounting of the history of asylum that the practice of asylum is never static, just as the law of asylum is always contested. When a person's homeland becomes the site of persecution because of their race or their religion or one of the other protected bases as they stand today, the law of asylum promises refuge. But a right is only as real as a right bearer's ability to use it. And the criminalization of migration has proven a major obstacle to fulfilling this human rights norm. In 2018, going back a little ways in time, in 2018, the United States adopted a practice of criminally prosecuting people who entered the country without the federal government's permission, even if they came here fully intending to ask for asylum. At the time, President Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, put it like this, explaining the government's new policy. If you cross this border unlawfully, then we will prosecute you. It's that simple. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. Those were the words of then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Well, entering the United States without the government's permission, that is a federal crime. It's also a common feature of asylum seekers. The federal statute that codifies asylum applies only to people who are physically present in the United States. But it doesn't make an exclusion for people who entered without authorization. Indeed, leaving out of asylum people who came to the United States without the government's permission would make little sense if the goal is to provide safety to the persecuted. Because persecution, it turns out, sometimes does not make room for carefully planned and meticulously documented exit. But if asylum law is unable or unwilling to bend to the messy realities of human conditions, then law's requirements evolve from being pillars that aspire to ensure equal access to legal process. and they become weapons that can be used to bludgeon. Over the weekend, over just this last weekend, Border Patrol agents were recorded charging their horses into Haitian migrants, including a little girl who appears from the video footage probably no older than 8 or 9 years old. Another agent twirls a horsewhip in an ugly reminder of past moments in our nation's history when whips were also aimed at Black bodies. Now, these images are new, but the government's willingness to respond with this kind of violence to Haitian migration is not. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, in the waning days of the Duvalier regime in Haiti, Haitians began to leave the island, heading to the United States in large numbers. After a quarter century in which U.S. immigration policy had thought of detaining migrants as the exception, not the norm, the Carter administration in that period in the late 70s and early 80s, as Haitians were starting to come to the United States in increasing numbers, shifted gears, responding by inaugurating the era of immigration imprisonment from which we have yet to part. Throughout the 1980s and then throughout the 1990s, multiple presidential administrations, the Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton administrations led by Republicans and led by Democrats, conjured new methods of expelling Haitians. Long before the Trump administration launched its migrant protection protocols, the Remain in Mexico initiative, to block migrants from reaching the United States and instead requiring them to wait outside of the United States in Mexican border towns, while US immigration officials considered their asylum claims long before that happened. The Reagan administration pioneered a policy of interdicting Haitians to keep them away from the United States. Outside the United States, outside the reach of US law, administration officials claimed, if interdiction occurs outside of US territories, the determination of refugee status would not be governed by the Immigration Act, Reagan's Immigration Task Force wrote in that period. Now, Coast Guard vessels and immigration officers working for the now defunct Immigration and Naturalization Service, the now defunct INS, operating under this interdiction policy, would take to the seas to find migrants and to send them back. The United States must distinguish between refugees and economic migrants, President Bush, George H.W. Bush said, justifying the continuation of this policy under his watch. A State Department official in the Bush administration added that stopping migrants before they reached the United States and returning them to Haiti, the country from which they were fleeing, was itself a humanitarian gesture. But fear and despair, despite that policy of stopping Haitian migrants and sending them back to exactly the place that they were fleeing from, risking their lives to get here. Fear and despair combined with the remarkable attraction of hope for a better life, or the attraction of the possibility of reuniting with family already in the United States, kept bringing migrants to this country. When interdiction was not practical, federal officials turned to confinement. First, they kept Haitians on board Coast Guard vessels in the ocean, in the Gulf, where they were crowded on board, exposed to the elements as they sat on the decks of these large ships. And meanwhile, the Bush administration tried to convince countries in Latin America and in the Caribbean to take them in so that they would go anywhere but the United States. And as they sat there, immigration officials would be deployed to those boats to process asylum requests. No one's surprise, they were mostly denied. Now, soon after, the Bush administration officials realized that this situation was not tenable over the long term. So soon after, they considered reopening Alcatraz. They considered reopening Ellis Island to house these primarily Haitian migrants. And eventually, they settled, instead of Alcatraz, instead of Ellis Island, they eventually settled on an abandoned missile site near Miami, where the federal government built the early version of an immigration prison called Chrome that still stands today. But captivated by the possibility that holding migrants outside the United States would mean holding them outside the reach of US laws, President George H.W. Bush chose a different location, Guantanamo, Cuba, as a new site for the federal government's growing immigration prison archipelago, taking a part of the US naval base that remains in one corner of the Cuban island. Well, more than a decade before Guantanamo would become famous as the chosen site for prisoners accused of having ties to Al-Qaeda and having some kind of link to the attacks of September 11, 2001, federal officials built a sprawling immigration prison on the island's military base in Guantanamo, where Haitian migrants were very well represented among the detainees. Under the guise, resonating with a more recent development, under the guise of promoting public health, the island prison even featured a section for people with HIV. It was started under President Bush, and when he was campaigning, then Governor Bill Clinton promised that he would shut it down when he was campaigning for the presidency. Said he would shut it down. Months after entering the White House, month after Clinton entered the White House, the Guantanamo prison continued as before. And in an order instructing the federal government to shut down the Guantanamo facility in the summer of 1993, a federal judge wrote, although the federal government, euphemistically refer to its Guantanamo operation as a humanitarian camp, the facts disclose that it is nothing more than an HIV prison camp. The Haitians' plight is a tragedy of immense proportions, the federal judge wrote, calling out this humanitarian gesture for what the court viewed as nothing more than a tragedy of immense proportions. 18 months after that order to shut down the facility, more than 100 Haitian children were held there. And 18 months after that, there were 200 Haitian children held there. Human rights clashed with the politics of migration. Human rights bent to the politics of migration, and human beings suffered The juridical framework, central to almost a century's worth of legal developments in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere around the world, it proved incapable of resisting the push of politics. Rather, law became a symbol, a symptom rather, it became a symptom of the politics of migrant criminality. State violence in the form of criminalization, in the form of imprisonment, in the form of family separation, taking children away from their parents. Those various forms of state violence were deployed for the sake of power. And in the process, features of law that post-war generations imagined as inalienable, they were pushed to the margins of relevance. Despite law's fragility, juridical rights are invaluable. With the right to lay claim to a legal obligation, human beings are converted into citizens, not in the formal sense of citizenship law governed by the Immigration and Nationality Act, but in the sense of being able to affect the path of interpersonal relationships on more or less equal terms. The clash between human rights claims such as asylum and the criminalization of migration points to the limits of human rights approaches to migration. The winds of anti-migrant rhetoric reveal law's inability to contain the excesses of brute power, threatening to imprison, to convict, to deport, to remove from their children, and the country, that those who dared to enter the United States in search of safe harbor strips the law's textual promise of asylum into something worse than a shell of its former self, something worse than a shell of the aspiration of safe harbor that is at the core of asylum. And it's instead imprisonment and criminal prosecution, deportation and family separation at a punitive, criminalized bent to asylum that converts it into a weaponized mirage of its former self. Prosecuting hopeful asylees because they entered the United States unlawfully and yet as law allows, turns the United States asylum statute legal framework into an imaginary promise of life-saving assistance. Worse, I think it does so intentionally as the handiwork of policymakers who view asylum as just another threat in the nation's armor. In the late 1930s, when the fictional narrator Seidel was wondering what would happen to the human hordes, as Sagers puts it, perched on Europe's edge in Marseille. The real life Hannah Arendt was temporarily safe in Paris, having fled Germany after Hitler's rise. Well, a few years later, Arendt, who was a Jewish philosopher, a few years later, she would decamp to the United States, from where she would sharpen her perspective on the allure of Nazism, and from where she would deepen our generation's long understanding of the role of law and allowing some people to die and declaring others to be useful for nothing but death. Despite a generation's gap and a multitude of differences in the context, in context from the one that Hannah Arendt was concerned with, criminally prosecuting asylum seekers illustrates the subversion of one of Arendt's contributions to the theory of legality. Juridical recognition as a citizen is inextricably tied to acknowledgement as a person. If the law does not recognize in a person a right to be heard, then the law does not have to acknowledge the person's ability to speak. In effect, the law does not have to acknowledge the person's humanity. If legality does not define humanity, well, it does at least measure humanity's worth. Deny the ability to speak, deny the right to be heard. Nazi Germany decoupled the citizen from the person, according to Arendt. All that was left was the alien living in the midst of the citizenry's homeland, living in someone else's country. And at that point, the German state could do with the alien that remained anything or nothing. The United States criminalization of migration illustrates that the citizenship-based juridical framework that Arendt describes remains fleeting. Human rights norms grounded in claims to inherent human dignity appear incapable of steering the course of legality. Human dignity, it turns out, is immensely malleable. It's as robust as law allows and as politics demands. This fluidity is both its greatest promise, but it's also its weakest link. Arendt focuses on the most gruesome example of its weakness. The manifestation of its promise is more difficult to pinpoint. But more important, I think, is that between the two, between the most gruesome example of its weakness that Arendt highlights and the manifestation of its promise, wherever that is, more important is that between those two ends lays a vast spectrum of human experience, a vast spectrum of legal evolution, and an enormous spectrum of political contestation. The fervent embrace of a policy of targeting asylum seekers is a reminder of the fragility of human rights jurisprudence. In the name of securing the nation, government officials declared themselves willing to deny people the ability to request modern legality's foundational safe harbor of asylum. Law became a symptom of the politics of migrant criminality. So far, that terrible greeting that welcomed victims of the Nazi regime to Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei, work brings freedom. So far, we have only seen that appear on a sweatshirt inside the US Capitol, not above its entryway. But we do not need to near the displays of brutality that concerned Arendt to worry, and I hope that we worry long before we near those displays of brutality. In the images of Border Patrol agents chasing Haitian migrants on horseback, whips and the beautiful muscularity of a horse's thick neck use literal force to repel migrants. Push them back across the river, one threat of injury at a time. Violence wielded in the pursuit of power and cloaked in the law's legitimacy should always be alarming. Arendt feared that, as she put it, violence administered for powers and not for law's sake turns into a destructive principle that will not stop until there is nothing left to violate. Her point was rather simple. Law legitimately sets the boundaries of the state's permissible use of violence. Without law to guide its use, what constraints are there on a state's exercise of its coercive strength? Early on in the pandemic, in the spring of 2020, the Trump administration announced that it would tap a decades-old public health law to quickly expel migrants hoping to reach the United States, including people who wanted to request asylum. Known as Title 42 expulsions in honor of the section of federal law that ostensibly authorizes this measure, Border Patrol agents since then have routinely blocked migrants from entering the United States. Though it could have shifted course when it took over power from the Trump administration, the Biden administration never did. Indeed, explaining its response to the large numbers of Haitians who reached the Texas border over the last few days, the Department of Homeland Security reiterated its reliance on Title 42, noting in a statement, the majority of migrants continue to be expelled under CDC's Title 42 authority, pointing to that Trump era policy as an important tool in its continued efforts to repel these migrants who have reached the Texas border, originally from Haiti. And like the Haitians of decades past, blocked at the border, migrants subjected to Title 42 have a difficult time accessing the law of asylum in the United States. In part for that reason, a federal court recently found Title 42 to be illegal. The Biden administration is appealing that decision. And so we'll see how that litigation plays out. But today, it's about 8 months into the Biden presidency, and we're learning how the United States government responds when parents and children arrive at our borders in large numbers, as they did in those months in 2017 and 2018 when the Trump administration launched its policy of family separation. And today we see chartered aircraft that leave daily from Texas airports, landing in Port-au-Prince, where hundreds of migrants are being deposited every day. Going back to last weekend. For these people, Haiti is hell, the head of Haiti's migration office told reporters. Grounded in the wartime chaos and in the endless death, the novelist Anna Sagers and that the philosopher Hannah Arendt knew so well. Asylum laws today are not ready for the coming demands, the demands of the changing world, the demands of humans who are and will continue to seek safe harbor in the United States over the coming years and decades. Today, It's easier to say who is not eligible for asylum than it is to say who is. To turn the law of asylum into the actual practice of safe harbor. The challenge is to understand the limits of 20th century asylum law while embracing the urgent need for the law to evolve, as it always has. Only this time to do so in light of the challenges presented by the 21st century, now in 2021, and into the future, into the coming decades. Today, government officials wield batons and bullets, but so too do private gangs. So too do bands of discontented marauders. Today, nightmares arise from political mobilizations and from military incursions, but nightmares also come from hurricanes and mudslides, from droughts and rising seas. Today, death comes to people who have been stripped formally by law of the right to have rights, as Arendt famously put it. But so too does death come to people who have merely been shunned by lawmakers into a crevice of existence where rights exist formally as a matter of law, but where food does not, either in right or in reality. Now, today, most of you, I'm imagining, and certainly I, live in the place of refuge. People like us are empowered to decide who is welcomed. We get to decide who is not welcomed, and we get to decide why. But Arendt and Segers knew firsthand what we too know in some more removed way. The present is not necessarily the future. This ongoing situation that the consulates call transitory, but that we know in everyday language as the present, the fictional narrator Seidel says toward the end of the novel, as he contemplates whether he will live or whether he will die, whether he will become an unnoticed resident, invisible, or whether he will become the next addition to a concentration camp list. Sometimes the future comes slowly, as when political instability and economic misery push the intrepid to leave their homes, to gather what resources they can and aspire to life elsewhere. Sometimes the present is swallowed into the past quickly, as last summers when wildfires ripped through Colorado forests, destroying them. Forests that I know well, displacing entire communities of people who in many ways are just like me. The present, the fictional Seidel might have said, is always in flux. And whether in the future, those of us who are currently shielded by the enormous privilege, the enormous fortune, the enormous luck of US citizenship, whether in the future, those of us who are US citizens decide who is welcomed, who is not, and why? I don't know. That is not knowable. But in the early part of the 20th century that Arendt and that Sagers describe, humanity failed itself. From the ashes of that nightmare, asylum law modernized because civil society imagined that it should, and then organized to demand that it do so. Refuge should turn on persecution, they said, not on the formal ties of citizenship. Because asylum law has always evolved, I have no doubt that it will do so yet again. But whether it will provide a safe harbor against 21st century sources of death and despair, it depends on the courageous imagination of people like you. Are we willing to rewrite the law of asylum to modernize it for the days in which we currently live and for the days which future generations will hopefully see? It is, are we willing to rewrite asylum law so that it is no longer tethered to the past? To do that, we need to strip it of its ties to government conduct. We need to stop its privileging of a narrow set of horrors, persecution because of those 5 reasons that I mentioned earlier, and no more. Instead of all of those limitations, we can recenter the Heracles, who was welcomed in Athens despite his violence, despite his immorality. We can recenter Paul, who witnessed murder and did nothing. We can recenter the stranger who is not always outside of us, waiting, hoping to become part of our communities, but is always, in a different way, always in ourselves. To borrow the language of immigration law, we can embrace the alien in ourselves. That part of each of us that makes us flinch, from that part of each of us from which we hide, that part of each of us that forms the weakest aspect of our humanity. We can embrace those weakest features, those most reprehensible features of our individual humanity, even as we struggle, even as we try to keep them from coming to define us. Just as we can do with the law of asylum, as we go about deciding who can find safe harbor in this country. The courts will not do this because the courts cannot do this. Asylum, as it exists today, arose from the bloodshed of the Sagers of the Europe of Anna Sagers' life. From the Europe that her novel's protagonist is stuck inside of as death approaches quickly and violently. Asylum, as it exists today, arose from the ashes of that ungodly trauma. And it did so because we once before dared to reimagine a legal regime that aspired to salvation. Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. Hope is a discipline. Well, like all disciplines, hope must be studied and it must be practiced. I look to the past to understand how hope has given us the present. But I look to the present to understand how hope might give us a different future. In the hopefulness that brings migrants to our borders, time after time, year after year, generation after generation, in that simple act of mobility, I find room to imagine a hopeful future. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your questions and to your comments.
Well, thank you, Dr. Garcia Hernandez, for a powerful and thought-provoking analysis of criminal and immigration law and its history. And I am just blown away. I've got a million thoughts and questions myself, and just wanted to remind everyone that if you had any questions or comments as well for Dr. Garcia Hernandez, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And we'll try to take those in order. We've got about 15 minutes left for Q&A. And I just want to start off with something actually that we got by email before it even started. So people were excited to hear your thoughts even before you began. So this question kind of starts out by pointing out that Ohio high school graduates who are not citizens are being charged international student fees by public higher education here in Ohio, up to 3 times higher the cost, and that this is discouraging for capable students. And wanted to ask, have you heard about the Board of Regents being challenged in any way to change this policy, or I guess expanding that, any Board of Regents, across the country who may have been, challenged to change this kind of practice?
Yeah, my initial reaction is I'm laughing, not because this is a funny question at all. It's not. It's because right now my knowledge of Ohio, I feel like it's a success when I can get from my apartment to my office without getting lost, as I did a couple weeks ago. So no, unfortunately, I am not yet sufficiently enmeshed in Ohio to have any sense of what's going on with the Board of Regents or any other entity. But I can comment more broadly about some responses that have been adopted in past years in other jurisdictions in other states. Certainly, it is not uncommon for state legislatures to enact legislation that allows students who meet residency requirements to access public higher ed as in-state residents can, and without regard immigration status. Some states have taken a narrower approach, extending that to recipients of deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA. But certainly in several states, DACA is not the only route to in-state tuition. You just have to meet sort of the residency requirements as apply to other any other students.
Yeah, thank you for that clarifying answer. And the next question kind of goes back to asylum law. And they were wondering if you could clarify what asylum law says around passing through other countries on the way to the US, with the questioner knowing that it's an argument that is often talked about in opposition to asylum seeking in the US, that, you know, if a person is traveling through another country on the way to the US, then that's where they have to stop. And they were wondering if that's correct or if there is more to it.
Yeah, so asylum law certainly does bar people from obtaining asylum if they have traveled through a safe third country. So not their country of origin, not their country where they're requesting asylum, but a third country where they could have requested asylum, and often did not for whatever reason. This is coming up a lot in the last few days with regard to many of the Haitians who have made their way to Texas, and specifically to that Del Rio gathering that's been in the news a lot lately, because many of these individuals did not flee in the aftermath of the recent coup or the recent earthquake, but have actually been actually left the island many years earlier and were living in various parts of Latin America, Chile being one of the principal countries, and so yeah, that is a significant legal limitation that applies. And I think this is part of my critique of asylum law as it currently exists. There's no shortage of documentation of anti-Black discrimination in Chile. There's no shortage of anti-migrant discrimination in Brazil. So Brazil, for a period of several years, was pretty liberal about welcoming Haitian migrants in particular, because they had a lot of construction projects going on in the lead up to the Olympics. That has, that's now in the past, and as often happens, things these low-paid laborers were not wanted anymore. That to me does I think illustrates the limitation of this third safe country requirement, which is, the discriminatory treatment is not one that I think anyone should be expected to suffer. Not in the country of their citizenship, not elsewhere. And instead, we ought to be thinking about why it is that people are coming to the United States. People don't come to the United States because they sort of spin a globe and see where it stops, as they put their finger down with their eyes closed. They're coming to the United States for a particular reason, and in most instances it's because of the history that the United States has with the country that they're citizens of. The United States has a long history of involvement in Haiti, and we of course have a large Haitian community in various parts of the United States, which means not only that there is some generic familiarity between Haitians and the United States, but that oftentimes there is a very direct and close personal tie between people in Haiti and people in the United States. Family members, for example, maybe it's spouses, maybe it's children, maybe it's parents, maybe it's siblings, what have you, but those ties those ties exist. And so I think I think we have to, what I'm hoping that we do, and I'm urging that we do, is to think about what is the role of asylum, not what are the legal strictures that currently define asylum, but what place do we want asylum law to occupy as we move forward further into the 21st century, grappling with the changing world.
Yeah, and this is definitely a prime time to be answering that question on so many fronts. Like you said, the legal structures that we have don't seem to be able to keep up with the realities that we see in our world. And so, there are plenty of other reasons to be asking this in terms of racial justice, but just on a specifically just pragmatic level, being able to ask these questions too. The next question is wondering if you would see some of the similarities between the Nazi denial of personhood and citizenship that you talked about to certain groups, to the justifications not only for American slavery, but also the denial of full citizenship to those who were emancipated.
There's many scholars who have done fantastic work on tracing the ties between the eugenics of movement in the United States in the early part of the 20th century and its influence on Nazi Germany and then on the ideology of that was at the center of the Holocaust. I would point people to that work rather than pretend to be the best, the most authoritative source on that. But I think the links are quite clear, and the role that law has to play in limiting the worst excesses of the state's coercive powers should not be understated. The law is what gives us the right to be heard, but that right needs to actually be made real. And there's no shortage of instances in which people have a legal right, a legal claim, but because of various factors, money, gender, geographic location, language, some ability limitation, they cannot access those tools that the law ostensibly provides them, and we can push people through legal processes as if none of that matters, or we can actually try to allow people to be in the best position possible to seek legal redress, to lay claim to the legal rights. In the immigration context, what we see a lot, and an example of this that we see quite often, every day, is that people who are going through the deportation process in immigration court are not entitled to have a lawyer if they're not able to pay for one. So there's a right to hire a lawyer. But there's not a right. You're not appointed a lawyer if you don't have the ability to pay for one, or are not able to convince somebody to work for free, which means that these life determinative decisions that immigration judges are making daily about who gets to live and work in the United States, who doesn't, are often being made by hearing from a trained government prosecutor, and then expecting a response from an ordinary person, right, who is not at all trained in the law, may not speak English, may not be familiar with U.S. customs, maybe a child. We have children who go through the process without access to a lawyer, right? And so that, to me, is an example in which the laws willingness to blind itself to the reality of how law applies on ordinary people strips the law of legitimacy. And that to me, I think has some strong echoes in the willingness of past instances in which the personhood is sort of stripped from the center of attention in the way that we go about designing legal processes.
Yeah, very powerful. So many thoughts come up, but I've got to get to the next question. Another question, a really good one, talked about, reiterated the asylum law being focused on prosecution, but given the need for asylum law to evolve, do you see a scope expanding for granting asylum to climate-related forced migration? Like I said, it's definitely the time for that to come up, and I thought that was a really good question.
Yeah, I think it has to be. I think if asylum law does not evolve very soon to address climate-induced migration, then asylum law is going to become somewhere between, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, the kind of weapon that can be used to bludgeon people and saying, well, you do not meet the requirements of asylum. You do not meet the requirements of the legal safe harbor, right? And I think actually that makes this, that fear for me is a very real one. One, because I am concerned about the increasing number of people who find that their homes are becoming less habitable or even inhabitable, and law is asylum law in particular is entrenched. It is very slow to move, and the last radical restructuring of asylum law arose out of the horror of horrors. I hope that we do not have to live through something like that before we muster the courage collectively to reimagine and modernize asylum law. For the obvious reason that so many people died, and so right now I find there are certainly lawyers who are trying to expand asylum law to reach climate people who are fleeing to the United States because of climate induced habitability problems. But I think this is a slow evolution, one that frankly I don't see fully grounded in the existing asylum regime, but one that I think does present the possibility of inverting the relationship that those of us who currently have with asylum law may not always have, right? With those of us who are U.S. citizens and are full members of the political community that says, sorry, the hurricane is not persecution by a government actor, because it's not. Will we always get to do that? Is Louisiana just going to disappear? And all of those people who live in Louisiana going to be forced to go elsewhere? We're going to shut them out of other communities? Are those of us who live in California, where wildfires and mudslides, in Oregon, right, in the Mountain West, are constantly grappling with a lack of water, places like Arizona and Nevada, where are we going to turn to when we need these basic components of human life? And what is that going to mean for our ability to continue living in the place that we call home, or to recreate a home in a new location? And are we going to be on the short end of that relationship, asking to be let in and being told no. I mean, this, if we restructure asylum law because of some altruistic motivation, great. If we do it out of self-interest, I'm okay with that too.
Very good answers. Very good answers. And this has been a wonderful conversation. And unfortunately, we are at a little bit at time, and we didn't get to every question. So my apologies if we did not get to your question. But this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you, Dr. Garcia Hernandez, for all the insights that you shared. I think, half of the things in our answers are just appreciations for what you shared. So, much appreciated from our audience. Much appreciate the questions as well. And just as a closing reminder, we will be back in another 2 weeks with our next forum. And the recording for this forum will be sent to attendees and also on our social media within the next couple of days. So feel free to look at that. But just as a final, thank you, Dr. Garcia Hernandez, for being with us for our forum and sharing with us today.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. All right, everybody, have a good afternoon.